Chapter 6. 11th grade, Fall Term 2009 and Spring Term 2010. The Fall Term of 2009. Now when all the 93ers had started high school, I got to know plenty of new people, especially from Earsbuda. I already knew pretty much all the 93ers from the other two hoods, but hardly any from Earsbuda until now. First I got to know the ones at Östra, and soon after that the ones at Dragon, despite me never being there once during 11th grade. That wasn't only because two of those girls went there. Dragon had about 2,000 students, obviously a much larger place than Torun. It was also because Dragon was under construction, and thus about half of all the kids there were relocated at Mimerskolan. I also got only one long hour recess a week on Tuesdays, so therefore, I easily chose Östra. Otherwise, Dragon was just as easy to enter as Östra, if not easier, since Östra had about 1,000 students. I remember my first visit at Östra this fall. I bumped into one of the girls there. She approached me and apologized for what she had done. This time, I'd changed strategy and looked her dead in the eyes confidently. I saw clearly she wasn't sincere. Then she went away with a friend of hers who went to Östra and who wasn't involved in the beef herself. For a short while, I was worried she had actually started at Östra. Fortunately, she hadn't. I remember one of the guys asking what had happened, such as, "Has she been cheating on you?" or, "Were you together or something?" I was very evasive about going into what had previously happened. It just simply wasn't time for that. During September, I and my father took a vacation in New York State. We had planned it ever since the last fall. We took off from Umeå Airport on the Friday of September 18th at around 5 a.m. We landed on Arlanda right north of Stockholm about an hour later, and then we took off from there heading for New York. At around 1-2 p.m., we landed on Newark Liberty International Airport in Newark, New Jersey. We had turned the clock 6 hours backwards, so therefore, it was really around 7-8 p.m. at home in Sweden. We rented a car and drove all the way up to Rochester. The three largest cities we went through were Scranton, Pennsylvania, one of Joe Biden's hometowns, Binghamton, New York, and Syracuse. During the ride, I was fascinated by all the cars being so new and so clean compared to those in Sweden. I hardly ever saw older cars. We arrived in Rochester at around 10-11 p.m. My auntie lived there with her husband and children, so we got to live with them. They lived in a suburb on the outskirts of town, about 30 minutes away from downtown. I went to bed at around 11:12. Right there, I realized I'd been awake for up to 24 hours since in Sweden, the clock was around 5-6. I was fascinated by that also since I'd never been awake for that long before. On the Saturday of September 19th, I and the others visited Rochester Museum and Science Center located right east of downtown. Later the same day, we went to the restaurant Dinosaur Barbecue and ordered our dinner for the day, which we later ate at home. I checked out the toilet and I was fascinated by all the graffiti all over the walls. On the Sunday of September 20th, I and my father visited a shopping mall near where we lived. I don't remember much other than eating a Burger King cheeseburger and buying a Ben & Jerry's can. On the Monday of September 21st, I, my father and my auntie visited House of Guitars, a musical store located a bit north of downtown. There were mainly old CDs and LPs from the 70s, 80s and 90s. I was fascinated by all the CDs and LPs and all the graffiti on the walls. Then we went to Seneca Park Zoo located to the northwest of downtown. There were mainly third world animals there. Back in Sweden, I had visited an animal park in Lycksele quite often, but there we had only northern European animals. Lycksele is a small town with a population of about 10,000, located about 80 miles northwest of Umeå. The day before, I had researched the area around House of Guitars and the most probable route. I wanted to know if I would ride through or past a ghetto. There was a computer with internet connection in my temporary bedroom. It was far from an actual bedroom. It was more like a desk room and I got to sleep on a mattress. I used the computer almost every day researching where I'd just been and or would go next. House of Guitars was located in a suburban area not too different from where I was living now. But there was a ghetto a bit right south of the highway, Route 104. I got to go along Route 104, but the ghetto was overshadowed by trees and stuff, I think. Either way, I didn't get to photograph the ghetto. I used American Fact Finder, where I could find detailed information about USA and all its regional categories. States, counties, cities, zip codes, census tracts, etc. There were also thematic color maps for every regional category. I could, for example, see the percentage of blacks or the median income in all census tracts in New York City. All the information was from 1990 and 2000. All that information was removed on January 20, 2012. Fortunately, sometime during September or October 2013, I found Social Explorer, which has the same thematic maps as American FactFinder, but way better. But the information tables ain't quite as good, at least harder to reach. I had been missing those maps real bad for all those 2021 months. Unfortunately, or better yet fortunately, I've been way too busy doing other stuff since then. I just played with it a little that fall. However, in 2019 and 2020, when I got hit by chronic fatigue syndrome, I returned to Explorer among other things just to stay awake during the day. Then I discovered that there were even older maps, of which those with census tracts went all the way back to the year 1940. So now you can go in and check, for example, the percentage of blacks in several major city blocks in 1940. To my surprise, there were quite many racially mixed areas even in southern state cities such as Atlanta and Houston, at least in 1960 already. Further back, however, you have to settle for counties and states, at least for free. The rest is way too expensive. On the Tuesday of September 22nd, we visited a vineyard located about an hour south of where we lived. Along the way to and from the place, I photographed quite many shabby houses and even one or two trailer parks. The rural areas south of Rochester looked quite poor compared to the suburb we lived in. Right before coming home, we drove through a wealthy neighborhood where everyone lived in big mansions and where there was a country club. We lived in an ordinary middle-class neighborhood not much different from Grubby. On the Wednesday of September 23rd, I and my father finally went to the Big Apple, New York City. We took off from Rochester and landed on JFK about an hour later. Then we rode a bus through Queens to Manhattan. I sat on the right side of the bus intentionally since it would of course drive on the right side of the road. It would be much easier photographing the neighborhoods we would ride past. I also researched beforehand which neighborhoods we were most likely to go past. I expected us to go along Van Wyck Expressway and Long Island Expressway. It became quite obvious that the east side of both ways were poorer than the west side. Therefore, I easily chose the right side of the bus. We also got to go along Van Wyck and Long Island as predicted. I hoped we would get to go right past Queensbridge, the infamous public housing project that's produced rap acts such as Nas, Cormega and Mobb Deep. I didn't, unfortunately, but I did get to go right past Lefrak City, a less-known project where Cool G Rap and NORE came up. I also got to go right past Jamaica, right after leaving JFK, the neighborhood that's produced rap acts such as Onyx and 50 Cent. Then when we got to Manhattan, we went to our hotel located on 29th Street near Broadway. The hotel had about 10 floors and we got to live somewhere on the upper half of it. There was a computer with internet connection not too far from our room. I used that computer 5 to 10 minutes once a day just to check on Facebook quickly and write short updates about my NYC visit. That's how it was back in these days. I at least didn't have a flat cell phone with internet 24/7. Later the same day, we bought a camera a few blocks away from our hotel. I still got that camera to this day. I noticed right away that the vast majority of the staff was Jewish. I also saw a lot of Jews around the block, outside the store. These Jews were real Orthodox, with their hats, braids and beards. You could spot them at a mile's distance. Then during the night, we went to Giants Stadium in New Jersey and watched a U2 concert. The rock band Muse performed as the opening act. On the Thursday of September 24th, we visited the American Museum of Natural History located between 77th and 81st Street. We walked all the way from 29th up to the museum through Times Square and Central Park. That became a 3-mile walk, which hurt my legs quite bad by the time we reached Central Park. After visiting the museum, we went to Rockefeller Center. We went all the way up to the top roof getting a great view of the city. On the Friday of September 25th, we visited Harlem. We took the subway and hopped off at 111th Street. When we got up to the surface, there was all black people around us. Hardly any whites and hardly any Latinos neither. This was the central part of Harlem, which has been predominantly black for decades, unlike other parts of the area. We went along Lenox Avenue and then I started worrying that something would happen. I got to take a few photos, but then my father told me to put the camera down since it could easily get snatched. I couldn't afford to allow this camera to get snatched in New York City out of all places, only 2 days after buying it in the same city. I'd planned on going all the way up to 125th Street. I really wanted to visit the intersection of 125th and Lenox due to Gil Scott-Heron's album, Small Talk at 125th and Lenox. But when we approached a subway station at 117th, I decided right away to hop on the train right there. I didn't have the guts to go any deeper into Harlem right now. I decided to leave 125th to the future, so I have yet to visit that intersection. Later the same day, we visited Ground Zero. Then we walked around Chinatown and Little Italy. Then we had dinner at a Chinese restaurant, located far north of Chinatown near our hotel. On the Saturday of September 26th, we walked around Manhattan a little. Then we took the train to the Newark airport and took off for Sweden. I think we took off at about 1-2 p.m. We landed on Arlanda at about 5 a.m. in the Sunday morning. A few hours later, we took off for Umeå and then we were finally home. I had taken hundreds of photos which I uploaded on Facebook right away. This wasn't my first trip. I and my father also went to Stockholm in August 2004, right before I started 7th grade. But being in the US, or better yet just simply abroad, and this was the very first time abroad for me, was a real magical experience. I was euphoric the entire week, which I was hardly ever otherwise, so I grabbed the opportunity to really enjoy the moment. Otherwise, I was really just angry all the time, but at the same time very committed and determined. Of course, the constant anger became hard to deal with, but not only did I not see a way out of it, I learned to turn it into my main fuel, my best friend actually. The anger became like a fire that burned away all the dirt of self-hatred. It got stronger obviously because I had to deal with one or another of those girls at one or another event that didn't have an age limit of 18. Just staying at home just because one of them might show up was an unforgivable sin, but of course I didn't like seeing them have fun with everyone else. Fortunately, I had new homies now, mainly from Erzbuda. Their presence made things a whole lot easier at a number of events. Quite often during high school, I happened to walk past one of the girls, for example downtown, when they hung with one and more female friends who weren't involved in the beef, and who often knew me very poorly, if at all. Usually they saw me and waved and/or sneered at me, in front of their friends. I have every reason in the world to believe they went around backbiting me in front of everyone else, telling them about the whole incident. I can't possibly know exactly what they told them, if they even said anything about it, but at least I can be sure they never told my version of the story. That would have been a suicide on their part despite the current stigma around mental illness, being bullied and vulnerable. Because there's always been a stronger stigma, cooperating with authorities, in this case the head teacher. Snitches have never been popular. Droskin had closed as a nightclub. Soon after I got home from New York, I started seeing posters from Krugen, a nightclub that would open up on the Saturday of October 3rd. I decided right away to turn to that place from now on. Krugen was located in Oldham, on the north side of the neighborhood mall, so now I really looked forward to being in Oldham every weekend. I went there for the first time on October 3rd. I took the bus, line 1, straight to Oldham, walked through the hood straight to the mall. At the mall, I bumped into one of those girls and some friends of hers. They were having a meal at the Belou Grill, a small kebab restaurant well known in Umeå. They noticed me, but I just kept going without saying anything. I can't remember what they said, if they even said anything. Then after having put myself in line for Krugen, that girl walked out of the mall and then passed the line, to my right side together with a friend of hers. She sneered at me like usual. I kept calm, but I became somewhat scared and sad. A kebab restaurant in Sweden usually serves kebab, falafel, hamburgers, chicken and pizza. And pretty much 99% of all those restaurants are operated by Middle Easterners, at least in Umeå. Then I entered the club. I bumped into plenty of people I knew, but I had a hard time getting their attention. The first night went real bad, and I can easily blame it on bumping into that girl. From then on, I walked around the mall instead of through it. The next Saturday went much better. I got much better attention and I never bumped into any of those girls this time. Then I kept going to that place every Saturday. Almost every time I bumped into a bunch of guys that were clearly criminals. I knew some of them since before and some of them not until now. The way I felt at the time, they became the very best aspect of Krugen. Sometime during October, my blog stopped working. Someone who underestimated me because I was middle class put out all my personal information, name, address, birth date, etc., as a comment. Of course, he was anonymous. I reported that comment to an administrator and then the blog stopped working altogether. But that was only good, cause then I decided to start a new blog. And this time, I started rewriting rap songs, making them more personal and original. I was real proud of having made something of my own, although it was clearly based on other people's art. Just like on my last blog, I took the rappers in alphabetical order, then their albums in chronological order, and then the songs from respective album. I also wrote quite many texts from scratch about diverse subjects. This blog became much better than the last one. I was madly retarded for never recording any of the lyrics, which I easily could have done when I was home alone, which was quite often actually. I also went to a music production class and I also experimented with the program Magic's Music Maker back in elementary, about 4th to 6th grade. That would have taken me much further than just putting out lyrics. It was probably that I didn't want to be a copycat. I didn't have any lyrics from scratch at the time. That was hypocritical since I did put out the lyrics themselves already. They were also really exaggerated. Obviously, since they were all American, African American also, and you can imagine what that meant. N-words, starvation, crack rocks, automatic weapons, life sentences, etc. Today's Swedish gangsta rap of this time. It was also mainly American hip-hop that I listened to at the time, much due to the lack of Swedish hip-hop available at the time. I also could have easily gotten into trouble because of how I dissed those girls in the lyrics, and they were hardly any, if any at all, lyrics where they were never mentioned. I never thought about releasing the few songs where they were never mentioned, or at least referring to them without profanity, now that I had already made that mistake. I also never rewrote any Swedish lyrics until the summer of 2012. On the Wednesday of November 4th, during the fall break, I got the swine flu, today's COVID but with much shorter longevity and no government action. Fortunately, I never got hospitalized nor vaccinated. There was a lot of talk about the flu being deadly but also a lot of talk about vaccinations leading to side effects such as paralysis. I was also more likely to get hurt by the vaccination rather than the actual flu itself. Therefore, I never vaccinated myself. During that same Wednesday night, an event called the High School Festival was being held at Krugen. I went there despite having just gotten sick. But everything went fine though, and none of those girls showed up despite the age limit being only 16 for the night. But after that night, I never left the house for 2 weeks. There I got my quarantine, hehe. Fall break in Sweden is a week-long holiday usually during early November each year. It's similar to spring break in the US but it occurs in the fall instead. During that same period, I got to learn about the Illuminati. I read about it on a female friend's blog. Soon after, it quickly spread like wildfire among everyone, so I was far from alone in learning about it. According to how the Illuminati were portrayed at the time, they were a secret society made up of the world's 13 wealthiest families, including the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. They ran most mainstream media outlets, entertainment industries and governments. They also poisoned food, drinking water and vaccines. Their final goal was to exterminate 90 to 95% of the entire world's population and then control the rest, since 7 to 8 billion is way too much to handle. I immediately became real interested in them. I got a lot of unanswered questions answered. Finally, I got a real explanation as to why society was set up the way it was. Finally, we had an official name for this quote, system, I'd always known about. The Illuminati also reminded me a little of the ASP class. It's very secret and unknown, and it's also quite like a fantasy world where everybody's totally detached from reality. Ever since 2008, I'd been comparing the ASP class to religious cults. Now I had something new to compare it to. I wasn't exactly happy to learn that so many African Americans, such as Barack Obama and Jay-Z, were serving the Illuminati. I'd always thought of them as independently successful blacks. The upside to all this was that this reminded me strongly of those girls. At the time, I saw them as sellouts, or quote, acting white, like they were working for the head teacher. It looked very much like that the first few weeks, meaning the last few weeks at Brentis. Quote, my war, you're one of them. You say, that you're my friend. That you're one of them. End of quote, from the Black Flag song, My War. I was glad to hear this song in GTA 5 in the fall of 2013. I also can't say they were acting white. It was only one of them, an average white girl who just happened to go to the same junior high school class as the other three. She was the one who left the quote, game, as soon as we left Brentis. But the other three who kept going came from the hood, and I can't really say they were any less quote, ghetto, than the others only because we had beef, even though it involved my teacher to some extent. There was plenty of snitches and such even back in these days. I also knew a whole lot of other girls who were exactly the same, but who I got along with just fine. For most people, all this Illuminati stuff became nothing but a temporary phase ending before New Year. But for me, this became a permanent change. I kept studying them throughout 2010 after having learned most about it before New Year. Early on, I got to know about Alex Jones, a radio journalist from Dallas and Austin, Texas who had been talking about the Illuminati ever since the mid-90s but hadn't gained any real fame until about 2008 or 9. This guy, in combination with Chris McCandless, Henry Rollins and all these black sellouts made me realize even more that one's manhood and/or authenticity is measured by deeds and intentions, not skin color or social class, just like Islam says. Now I had gotten even further away from all this old self-hatred. But I still compared myself too much to blacks and other minorities. I hadn't really gotten past that yet. I also started streaming Alex Jones pretty much daily around this spring, which would continue for years. I also started reading his news articles daily, which could take up to an hour sometimes. All the other newspapers, Swedish ones that is, that I read daily never took more than about half an hour totally. One of the main reasons for that was that he constantly put up new videos. Of course I didn't watch or listen to all of them literally, but it did become a treadmill straight up. Ever since I can remember, I've dug real deep into one thing for some time and then got finished with it fully and moved on with whatever I got from it. For example, I dug deep into the Illuminati, different sources that is, during this winter and spring, but then I got finished. I've also since 2007 or 8 went through entire discographies, with every album twice at the spot, and then gotten finished. And even if I've listened to most of it a number of times after that, it's never led to some kind of monotone treadmill like Alex Jones. On top of talking about the Illuminati, he was also real spiritual, much due to his Christianity. But he wasn't quote, too religious, meaning the type who quoted the Bible all the time. He became a straight-up father figure for me, like a white Christian Malcolm X. He got such a grip on me, with all understanding. He had a very positive influence on me religiously. But then sometime during the late fall of 2012, he lost that gleam. He didn't become a straight-up sellout, but a little bit more stiff, more like just another news anchor and no longer that emotional father figure. He also recruited coworkers who I'd like to compare to nannies pretty much. But I kept stubbornly searching for that spirituality, but consequently, I got a bit dried out and brainwashed, while getting more out of life as a whole those years. That's a different chapter. He was still right about most of what he said, even when it came to personal opinions. But I became bad at thinking for myself and/or thinking in terms of personal circumstances being Swedish and all. I also bombarded Facebook with his videos and articles, meaning sharing several a day. Not only did it annoy a lot of people, but the subjects in question were often totally irrelevant to our reality as youths/minorities in Sweden. Otherwise I had already been bombing FB with random Swedish news articles since about a year back. All this bombing Facebook, which I kept doing for several years ahead, was probably rooted in my constant search for attention and confirmation, which in turn was rooted in all these years of self-hatred and the constant feeling of being invisible and straight-up non-existing. I think I also tried to save the world, not much unlike Alex Jones himself actually. But since long ago, I've realized I made a fool out of myself and that I became annoying to everyone else that way. But at the time, I just couldn't see that. I was just too blind simply. One similarity between Obama and those girls is that the public believed that everything would get better now when this white Republican named George W. Bush would be succeeded by this 15 years younger black, or better yet half-black, Democrat. Alex Jones criticized him from the very beginning and was instantly called racist. Now several years later, Obama turned out to be much worse than Bush, but yet many Americans, let alone African Americans, still had faith in him only because he's black and/or a Democrat, while those same people started hating Bush during his first term already. My case with these girls was similar. I believed everything would get better after graduating junior high and thus leaving the ASP class. But then came the girls and messed it all up for me. They hurt me a lot worse than that guy or the head teacher, just like Obama's hurt the planet a lot worse than Bush. Need a little clarity? Check the similarity. I remember discussing the Illuminati with my psychologist one time during the spring of 2010, which I'd met regularly ever since 6th grade. I told her about the Illuminati and how I learned about it. Then I compared it to the ASP class. She refused to believe anything I said. I remember her saying I believed in it because I was still young and thus easily manipulated. I told her all my friends believed in it, and then she went on to say they probably had ASP because they believed in it. She knew full well that these were hundreds of youth, none of which had ever gone to any kind of special needs class. How could she possibly believe all of them had ASP only for believing in the Illuminati? I wonder what she would have said, or if it even would have made any difference, had I told her most of these youths were racialized. As of the fall of 2021 and onwards, I started seriously questioning just about everything I had learned about the Illuminati over the years, eventually invalidating about 90% of everything I'd learned. I and many others had good reasons to believe in it back in these days. We were by no means irrational, and in many ways it alleviated a lot for me like I just described. However, these beliefs started becoming more of a disadvantage to me starting from about 2015, and that had nothing to do with Alex Jones. I wrote a post about that on September 26, 2022. The spring term of 2010. 2010 got a real bad start. I was forced to remove my blog for the second time, on New Year's Day out of all days. I had added plenty of random whites on Facebook, all because we had, quote, enough mutual friends. As I got more friends, the people I had enough mutual friends with increased steadily. I linked to the blog on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day on Facebook. Then someone contacted my parents about it. Then they told me that large parts of this blog were illegal and that I had to remove it. Throughout 2009, my parents had constantly complained about both blogs, but only a few times did they tell me to remove a certain song or text because it was illegal. But it wasn't until now they told me to remove the blog altogether. I could no longer decide what to throw away and what to keep, so I gave up. I didn't like losing all that freedom of speech that blog gave me. But I kept rewriting songs like usual, but without uploading them publicly until recording them later in life. A few days later, my sister, a couple of years younger than me, complained about us having too many mutual friends. She asked me why I had added all these white folks that she knew full well I couldn't possibly know. I told her it was because we had enough mutual friends, but then I realized also it was vain to add all these total strangers. I went on to remove about 100 to 200 friends on Facebook. Then there were left only minorities and some whites that I knew personally, either through the hood or Midgård. I also realized that all these random whites were the main reason I was forced to remove the blog. Had only the hood including these few whites seen it, I would have probably been able to keep it. During January, I started going zigzag through Oldham a whole hour every night around 10 to 11 p.m. before I entered Krugen, instead of going in right when they opened. It had been very empty the first half/full hour. The first few times, I hopped off the bus at Oldbacken and went down south. Later I started hopping off at the south of Oldham and going zigzag heading north. During this winter, people I knew started disappearing from Krugen, so I got quite lonely now at that place the whole night. Those criminals also disappeared during that period, and I know why. I sensed it at the time already, and I found out everything a few years later. On the Friday of March 5th, a new club called Five opened up in downtown. I went there expecting plenty of guys to show up, which I was right about. On the Saturday right after, I went to Krugen. There was nobody there I knew, so I left at midnight already. Normally I left between 1:30 to 2 a.m., never before 1. This was my last visit at that place for a long time. From then on, I only hung at 5 on Fridays. The buses went from Oldham only at around 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. There was no bus going around midnight, so I decided to take the same zigzag walk again, heading south this time. I started with the street Språkgränd, and right there I bumped into a few guys I knew. We went into a building entrance and then two of them pulled out small knives on me, about 5 millimeters thick and 2 inches long. Then I had a special gut feeling. I was of course a little worried I would get stabbed or robbed, but at the same time real proud to experience and hopefully survive something like this. I can't remember why they did this or what they said, but it was only to provoke me. Fortunately, I didn't get hurt. They let me walk and then I went straight to the nearby hospital, taking the bus home from there. During March, I started worrying about those girls turning 18, which they would do at different dates later this year. I knew I wouldn't be as safe at the club as I'd been so far. I tried to come up with ways to expose them in the ASP class. At first I considered doing it on Op Burgett, which was retarded, but then on one Easter morning in early April, I woke up with a new idea. Then I suddenly became euphoric. I had just come up with the idea of using the friend filter on Facebook, where I could decide exactly who would and wouldn't see each post. I'd seen the filter with my plain eyes for probably 6 months now, but the idea didn't hit me until now. Now I could use the filter to make some, and periodically most, posts visible to almost exclusively minorities. I started creating my own website with webs.com, which I left empty for a while. Then I started writing a long Microsoft Word text which I would copy and paste onto the website. The Swedish version of this book is loosely based on that text. It took about 3 weeks to write the text, which became about 19 pages long. On the Tuesday of May 11th, at around 7:30, I copied and pasted all the text on my until then empty website. Then I sent the link as a private message to all my friends on Facebook. I woke up about 30 minutes earlier than usual just to do all this right before leaving for school. This became one of the happiest periods of my entire life. I never thought I'd be able to put out even 5% of all that information until at least a year after having moved out of my parents' house. Consequently, I became euphoric 24/7 for the rest of 2010, unlike earlier when I was just angry all the time. On webs.com, I could check out how many visits my website got during a certain day. During the first day, it got about 110 visits. Then the site got more visits during the rest of the week. I got plenty of comments regarding the site. Many complained that the text was too long, and therefore, I doubt that everyone who visited the site really read everything. Now I realize I made some mistakes here. Not because I made the text too long, but because I made it too small and the rows too broad. I also had white text on a dark background. Then when I started using Weebly in 2013, I corrected all of those mistakes, but still things went quite good with Webs. The next Tuesday, I quickly rode past Torren right after having finished school early. I saw some guys from Oldham on the backside. I stopped by and went over to them, and then suddenly I saw one of those girls. No surprise, she went there after all. I stayed there for a while with some other dudes, and then the girl tried to talk to me. I looked her in the eyes confidently. She gave me the same old sneer as always. She obviously had no idea what I'd just accomplished. I didn't say too much. Fortunately, I didn't have to deal with her too much this time. For the second time, I got to enter the building, through the backside with the other guys. After about an hour, the principal kicked me out. During late May, I decided to quit hanging at nightclubs. It wasn't because those girls had turned or would turn 18. It was because I'd grown tired of being locked up in one and the same building for hours, listening to all this Illuminati music. Now I could be out on the streets instead, for free also. On top of that, 5 had started getting empty when it came to minorities, and I was no big fan of being surrounded by random white strangers. I also missed a long bike tour I took around the entire city one late Friday or Saturday night during August 2009. I think I did that because I found out Droskan was closed for the night first after I had left the house. Now I was real happy to be able to do that every weekend from now on. I went on to write more chapters on Webs, the last of which became the most controversial one. 2 weeks later, my parents were contacted by somebody regarding the site. I was never told if it was a private person who contacted them directly, or if it was the police who had gotten a report. Either way, I was given 1 hour to remove the site or else get arrested. Then I got to learn some things I couldn't write to any target group. But otherwise I continued to post on Facebook that quote, only the hood could see, and it went well actually throughout the 2010s. I would continue that way for years to come, with only a single quote, notification, during the winter of 2011 actually. I also received a notification my dad had gotten in the fall of 2013 for a post I had made visible to all of my friends. About 1-2 weeks before graduation, I decided trying to transfer to Östra. I wanted to do 12th grade in the social studies program there. But I got turned down and then I considered dropping out altogether. I wrote about doing it on Facebook and then it quickly turned into a huge discussion resulting in about 70 comments. Everybody wanted me to stay in school and graduate the next summer. I eventually decided to do so, fortunately. The reason I wanted to drop out was obviously that I wanted to go deeper into this hood/blat lifestyle. Knowing what I know now, there were much better ways to go, and dropping out was really not one of them. Switching school, or address, was never necessary neither. I also had no idea what the coming school year, and the year after, had to offer. Had I only known that, the thought of dropping out would have never crossed my mind. A lot of people told me I was, quote, acting blat, or exaggerating my problems. I admit I put a little bit too much importance on small things like the head teacher's Milanakis prohibition, that guy and my parents' San Andreas prohibition. But they seem to have forgotten that I had ASP and all the crap that brought, plus all the other diagnoses completely unknown at the time, and also having been severely bullied by these girls for the last 2 years now. They maybe thought that ASP just made me exaggerate things, which was true to some extent, but they seem to have a hard time understanding how much they would have missed out on had they themselves been born with the disease. I remember somebody saying things like, "Life ain't easy, don't be a coward, struggle, etc." I thought that sounded retarded. I made it real obvious that I thought life was too easy, meaning too white. There's a deep truth to that which I'll get back to soon. But at the same time, I never had to be hard as a rock. Knowing what I know now, I know what really went wrong and what was missing. And once again, it was never simply about address or school, nor color or class. Outside of this discussion, when people commented other Facebook updates, some people told me to seek help or linked to a mental institution. It was probably much a result of me going out with having ASP, which I hadn't done for more than 2.5 years. These were junior high school kids who were just kidding, but still I felt insulted. I felt powerless and helpless. I had expected a better response. At the time, I was just happy and proud to have put out all the information, and I'd learned to not care what other people thought about what I said. I'd seen people like Alex Jones and David Icke put up with several years of getting laughed at for all the information they put out. Of course I followed their lead, but that also led to me basically becoming a doormat. I saw it as getting laughed at just for talking. I didn't see my mistakes by exaggerating things and I never learned from them. I couldn't express myself better simply. Of course I got angry for the moment when I wasn't taken seriously, but I cooled off just as quickly. I was mad stubborn for trying to make people understand me, but now when I think about it, maybe I should have demanded some more respect and perhaps even removed them from my friends list for a year or so. Then maybe others would have taken me a little more serious, given that they already did actually. Then during 2012 to 14, I started doing the complete opposite, beefing with pretty much anybody over the smallest things. The beef with the girls taught me not to beef with just about anybody, but now I had forgotten that virtue completely. Now I demanded more respect than I actually deserved, but then when I converted, that's when I for the first time in my entire life finally became truly normal, even though I became far from fully practicing all at once. I became both self-critical and optimistic like never before. Those kids, most of which were born Muslims, really should have said, convert, and/or go to the mosque, instead, but at the same time I really should have made that decision much sooner perhaps. Because believe me, it surely made me normal, at least when it came to public behavior and social skills. And nobody's been able to say since then that I'm mentally ill simply because I believe in Allah and pray towards Mecca 5 times a day. But as much as I made it obvious how messed up I was, I also made it at least as obvious just why. People understood full well what I meant with everything I said, so it was actually only their fault that they called me mentally ill instead of understanding me, or at least trying to. And no matter how sick you actually are, you could always be right about something. A broken clock's always right twice a day. One great example of this is the character Haywire from Prison Break. Spoiler alert. He was certainly mentally ill, trying to get from Wisconsin near the prison in Illinois to the Netherlands with a wooden plate, while the others had already made it across the country to their mutual goal in Utah. But when he ended up in the same cell as Schofield, the main character, he noticed right away that his tattoos were a prison map meant for escape. Nobody else could possibly notice that. It's very typical that people with ASP or autism, especially the more severe ones like savants, are totally retarded but at the same time a genius at one single thing. It's always admirable, but unfortunately they hardly ever manage to use it to actually develop. They remain locked up in their own little world. Me having ASP have way too often been completely blind to the most simple, obvious things, but at the same time, I've just as often figured out the most complicated mazes. But given all my other diagnoses and my life as a whole, I really can't blame ASP. If I could drop the N-word in high school, I surely could already then quit eating pork. I stopped visiting my psychologist during this summer. Not only did I feel too old, but now I could talk to the hood at Facebook instead, which gave me much better results than talking to a white middle-aged woman who didn't know jack about hip-hop, and who also believed ASP was cool. Her obligation to silence didn't help much, and nor was it anything compared to the obligation to silence that runs in the hood. But I also would make a fool out of myself on Facebook a lot the coming years. I never learned what to put out and what to keep to myself until I converted. I experienced a lot more this summer than previously when riding around the hood, especially in Oldham. Not only because I rode around the entire city on the weekends, but also because I rode to and from the hood after dinner, around 6 to 8 p.m. on the school days instead of before dinner, around 3 to 5 like the 2 previous summers. That made a huge difference. I bumped into people a lot more often, and I also had a good number of quite tense situations. I'm only glad for that, haha. Until this summer, Umeå was like a desert for me during the summers since I was out during 3 to 5 instead of 6 to 8. That's when I was the most alone. During other seasons, I was well maintained by school, the youth center and then the club. Until this spring, I never went out on the weekend nights unless I had a special place to go. I obviously felt like I needed a good explanation to my parents until I turned 18, and even after that I wanted to have an explanation as to why I went out. But then when I left 5, I kept going out without a problem. Then during the summer, I also went out later during the day because it was quote, cooler, and at first I was a little surprised to meet people much more often. But now I realize that they thought just the same as me, that it's much cooler to be out later during the day. Having finished dinner also makes it easier of course, while earlier during the day, they had to go home for dinner unless they went to some restaurant. On the Monday of June 21st, I got my first summer job, at the hospital. I worked there for 3 weeks, until the Friday of July 9th. I and another guy my age worked in an archive, with a bunch of documents for mental patients. Usually we sorted the folders and filled them up with papers. We worked Monday to Friday 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., had a snack at about 10 and then lunch between 12 to 1. I got paid about 5,000 crowns, about $715 to $835 at the time.